Hello and welcome from John Cockburn-Evans and myself, Matthew Emerson. We're experienced coaches and consultants in the arena of change management and cultural transformation. And this is the latest in our series of leadership conversations. And today we're talking about the topic of what it takes to be a change leader, some of the challenges with that, and hopefully we'll elaborate a bit on what that looks like and what you can do to be more effective in that space. As with our other conversations, we're going to have a relatively informal discussion, and hopefully that will give you some insight. One of the triggers John and I had when we were discussing preparing for this topic was our respective experiences of what change leadership is, and the fact that some clients get confused or split between the change process and change outcomes. And I think having that ambiguity could be both a derailer in the effective delivery of change management programs, but also kind of point of consternation, if you like, for those involved in leading change. So we've both seen this, John and I have both seen this from different angles, and we're just going to try and explore the topic and give listeners a greater understanding of how you might look at this and perhaps put that into context in your own practice or organization. So, John, thanks for joining me for this conversation. Just to get us started, how do you see the need for a change agent presenting itself?
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, great question. I think as I go to try and discuss these aspects, I'll say that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Things are not mutually exclusive. Things do overlap. So I'd just like to provide a bit of perspective and context on that for the listeners before we start. So to answer your question, the need for a change agent arises generally when there's organizational stagnation, and more importantly, poor results or development. We mustn't forget that. We're not doing this just for the sake of doing it. The last point is critical because we should not be considering organizational change just for the sake of it. The change must be driven by a tangible performance outcome. So, of course, the specific, needs may be varied. They might be based on market-based results, sales, market share, profitability, etc. But they also may include some cultural stuff. So typically, these sort of things could be, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, a defensive or an antagonistic culture, poor employee engagement, that's something that's being talked a lot about at the moment, low morale, poor behavior, of course, which could be triggered by all sorts of things, low adherence to compliance, very important in certainly highly regulated industries, whether it be finance or engineering, and many more. Sure, Matthew, you can add loads of your own to this as well.
I think the things that you've just highlighted, I think, are significant, aren't they? And as you referred to, poor employee engagement, I think that comes up in a lot of different ways, and the terminology may differ in different industries or different businesses. But I think you're right. There's sort of deep-rooted kind of cultural points there, in addition to perhaps more the financially anchored examples that you gave at the beginning. And for me, there's sort of a range of things that relate to them around culture. And it might be, for example, again, you hear a lot of talk about innovation at the moment. It might be that the need for change is in the inability, let's say, to innovate or to produce something new, to create something new for your market. That may be deep-rooted in a cultural type of challenge, or it may be something about more process. But I think there's product development or innovation type examples, as well as things around customer or client satisfaction. I think, again, a lot of businesses would say they're very client-centric. How change manifests, or the need for change manifests in those sorts of examples, is also quite interesting. But again, it's sometimes hard to detach any of those things away from the examples you gave, which tend to be almost like the foundational sort of say cultural aspects of a business. But I think in any case, the need for change, and therefore the need of a change agent, as we described it, varied. I think sometimes not easy to see if you're in the organization. I think what's important, and what we discussed separately, was then what is a change agent? If we see the need for this thing called a change agent, then what kind of attributes does that person, that role, that party have that is different, let's say, to another role played out in the organization?
Yes, Matthew, absolutely. That's a great question. So The characteristics of a change agent are many and varied. You know, we'll just cover a few in this conversation because, as I said, it's not an exhaustive list, right? But I'll list a few of them and try and explain what the significance of these are, which again, hopefully will trigger a bit more debate. So the way I look at a change agent, they need at least some of the following characteristics or attributes. First of all, they need to be passionate. They have to be authentic. They need a level of focus, because without focus, then the inability, or they will have an inability to deliver on the results, because ultimately, tracking back to what we said earlier, this is about results. We're not just doing change for change's sake. They need to be an appropriate risk taker, which is quite important as well. And what do I mean by an appropriate risk taker? Somebody is willing to put themselves out there. I don't mean physical harm or physical risk, or even an engineering risk. I mean, somebody is prepared to stand up and be counted, which is really important. If they're not prepared to stand up and be counted, what's the point of them being a change leader? Obviously, a good listener. You know, it's the old adage, you know, 2 ears, 1 mouth. It's really important to listen. And we've said it over and over again, because without the listening, you're not going to get the context or perspective. And more importantly, the danger is it becomes about them as the servant, as the coach leader of the change agent. Actually, they need to be a servant leader, right? Which means they're serving the people in the service in the process. And in order to do that, they need to listen. So that's very important. They need to engage with people, you know, and that's founded in personality, approach, and other attributes that we've talked about earlier on, about things like passion and authenticity. You know, they need to be a thought leader. They need to be well read and well thought, because without that, they're probably going to get tripped up, or they're going to trip themselves up, because they need to have that deep understanding in order to really have an impact in the organization. And they need to have an enabler. They need to be able to motivate people, you know, use that passion. And this is where they're linked together. Use that passion in order to enable people to go and do what they need to do. And again, I touched on passion and authenticity earlier on. I mean, passion, I've just mentioned. Authenticity is really, really important, because that quite often gets confused with trust. And they're two different things. Trust is built over time. That's part of the relationship building. That's one of the reasons why I didn't mention it there, because that's part of the process. Authenticity is about saying what you do and doing what you say from day one, all the time. Because as soon as people see that you're not authentic, that's when problems will start, and you will lose your credibility in front of the team. So again, how do these play out? These attributes are set themselves in different space to a manager, right? Because this is sometimes a bit what they talk about between a leader and a manager, because the leadership is about engagement. But of course, these should also be considered as leadership qualities as well. Managerial qualities, you know, they do overlap, but there's a very defined process with management. Hopefully that is clear, Matthew.
It is. There's a couple of points in there. I guess you just made me think a bit more about the challenge that you give a manager if you're asking or expecting people in management type roles to both run a business operations effectively and try to consider how you lead a team or lead a business into a different space, that change leadership piece. Because I've seen time and time again, not through an individual not having the skills or not necessarily having the potential to be an effective change leader, but just trying to be both things simultaneously, it causes a real challenge at an individual level, you know, and strain in either their ability to be an effective change leader or their ability to focus on maintaining kind of business operations. So I think distinguishing both in attributes and then in potentially who you're expecting to do those different things is important. And then the other point you made then about the difference between authenticity and trust, I think is key. And actually what you made me start thinking about is relates to a couple of the other attributes in terms of listening and engaging, is for to be an effective change leader, actually and really understanding and having passion for the change at hand, not just walking the talk, if you like, as a change leader, irrespective of the content of the change. And again, I've seen that handled differently, but I think the authenticity word is key there, and really having genuine care for the change happening, and for the people involved in that change. So I think a range of things that it's hard to disagree with, and I think balancing up all of those attributes is not always easy. That probably leads me on then to where I was sort of thinking a conversation would go, which is, so given those distinct attributes and given the difference between what you'd expect of a manager and leader, it feels to me an obvious thing that we start considering where a coach or a consultant or another, somehow independent change leader would fit in. So can you talk to us a bit about that, John?
Yeah, absolutely, Matthew. But before I answer that question, I want to track back to something you said. When we're talking about managers and leaders, as we know, some really good managers have the attributes of the leader. But I think this is where, and it is possible to be both, this is where we walk the tightrope, as a change leader and a management, is really understanding what we are at any point in time, because that's very important. And again, it's about checking in with ourselves. I know we've talked on previous podcasts about self-awareness, but that's so, so important. And just an understanding that we are there and we are walking the tightrope. And I find that I know in my own situation when I'm doing those roles, that being aware that I'm walking a tightrope helps me be honest, because I've been a coach leader, I've done interim management roles, I've done operational management roles, and it just keeps me honest, if that makes sense, Matthew. So to go and answer that question, where does a coach fit in? Well, not all organisations have the skills or bandwidth to deliver on a transformation. So this is why they either have to use an internal coach or somebody else to act as a change leader. I like the word when you said another ego, possibly from another division, or hire an external coach with the right skills. And there's pluses and minuses for these different options and different approaches. An internal coach will understand the culture of the organisation, which may mean early engagement. However, it could backfire if they are seen as a disruptor from another business, leading to disengagement, because we know we like to live in a sort of very wonderful egalitarian world. But, I've worked in big corporations and I know there's been stresses and strains between different businesses and divisions, which of course could lead to disengagement, as we say. This is where an independent coach could have both the skills and experience, and this is where they can be brought in so they're able to disrupt appropriately. And I use the word appropriately. Disrupt is a very powerful term, but it's like any approach or any skill or any piece of knowledge or experience, it has to be used appropriately. And disruption is what it says. You're disrupting to create a bit of change, just to move things along a bit. It doesn't mean that you're causing conflict. So sometimes it may take more than one. This is where we have team coaching. This is where we either have a cohort or a team. This is where hiring the leaders or the stakeholders need to get it right when they're hiring coaches and team coaches. And in fact, I've been involved in teams working with clients where they want to hire internal coaches or select internal coaches. And I've helped them define the criteria for selection of a coach, following the criteria and attributes we talked about earlier. And that's very important, because I've seen organizations who've done consulting work where they've hired coaches or brought coaches in internally on their basis of either lots of previous experience or hierarchy in the organization or functioning capability. And it's really important that the attributes we talked about earlier are segregated from functioning capability and, to a certain extent, experience. And it's very important as well when you start to think about diversity, when you're setting up steering groups and focus groups and teams and everything else. Does that make sense, Matthew?
It does. And I think particularly that, as you were sort of talking towards the end there, the right solution for the challenge ahead. So just because somebody has been an effective change leader in a particular context, in a particular organization, or, as you say, with some experience of that, doesn't in itself necessarily mean they're going to be effective as an individual or part of a team in all circumstances. So I think that sort of short process you described in terms of actually really identifying what's needed and then sourcing the skills and expertise to address that, as you would with, hopefully most other sort of resourcing requirements, is definitely the best way, rather than the simplicity of, we know somebody's happened to have done this somewhere else before and therefore it may work. In my experience, I think that I'm trying to think if there are change programs or change circumstances that have sort of been like for like, and there's always something a bit different. There's always a new, I guess the nature of innovation and change generally, you know, that it comes with some slightly different ingredients. So you need to be able to apply those skills and that expertise that comes from experience, but as I say, not necessarily just like for like. So I think that's important, and that probably leads on to what we started off saying, you know, the difference between sort of change process, let's say, and change outcomes. You can run an effective change process, you know, be it the same way, regardless of the circumstances. But obviously, if it's the outcomes you're really looking for, then that change skill set or experience you're drawing on needs to be applied and be effective. So I think in perhaps following on from what you just said, it would be good to hear a bit more then about what specifically makes change leadership or change agency effective. Like, how do you go from just having the right attributes to having impact, let's say?
Yes, Matthew, that's a good follow-on question. So making change or transformation happen, it's a lot more difficult than people think. If it's going to have a long-term or sustainable impact on performance, then it will take some perseverance and engagement. And remember, we've talked about engagement earlier on. The change leader will have to face many different forms of resistance, and these can come in many different ways, whether it be individual resistance, whether it be resistance from teams, whether it can be even what I call systemic resistance, which means the internal processes the company has already can actually be resistance in itself. They may not be serving the change process. And that's why you have to look at things, and you've alluded to it earlier on, you know, there's a difference between, you know, changement through people and behavior and approach, and also changing of systems, both of which are very valid, and they have to go in tandem. You know, there are loads of really excellent change management models out there, and I know you've studied these as well, Matthew. So to mention a few, there is, you know, Jick, John Cockburn-Evans, and many others, right? This helps, it gives a framework for doing it. It still relies on people to do the work, of course, but there's some very common elements in that around walking the talk, around early wins, around communication, around having the processes right, having a sustainability plan in place before you become or come to the end of that change management session. All very, very important things. One of the things I do, and I always try and look at change or cultural transformation as a three-legged stool. So if you can imagine that every macro activity that we've just described represents a leg of that stool, if you don't have all three, it would fall over. And it's a bit like the milking stool. So if you imagine the first leg is improved processes and systems, the second one is positive changes in behavior, and the final one is passion for change. You know, I find this is a great reference as being a change leader. And it's quite interesting. Some people will come back to me and say, oh, we've got processes and systems in place. But I track back to what I said earlier. I said it's about improved processes and systems. Because if it's not working, you know, it's the old story, you know, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And the improvement doesn't mean necessarily faster. It might just be more appropriate. So there's no harm in looking at your systems. Behavior is very important because, you know, you'll have people with good behavior. Some people might have a negative attitude or negative behavior. They may not even buy into the process. And to glue it all together, you need to have the passion. And we touched on that earlier. If you don't have the passion for change, it's not going to happen. It becomes very mechanical and transactional. So, Matthew, have I answered your question there?
You have, yeah. And I think very clearly, and I keep going back to that three-legged stool. I'm just trying to, you've mentioned it, those sort of three legs, the three areas. For as much as I try, and I'm sure one day I will, John, find a fourth, but I can't. And I think the inevitability is that as you say, there's lots of detail and lots of things going on. But when you bring it to that kind of macro activity level and think that through those things, then each one is truly critical, as you say. Otherwise, the stool falls over. I think for me, the point you're making about, you know, process and systems and the improvement in process and systems sometimes gets overlooked because people, again, typically people who are involved in the operation of business feel like they already exist, or almost that the improvements are more tangible and straightforward. I think that's sometimes a mistake. But I think the positive change in behaviour is complex, is hard. It's both, you know, setting out as an example from a change leader, from leaders all around, I guess, the change, but also trying to make a way of having that behaviour have a knock-on effect, right, and sort of generating that positive shift potentially amongst many people. So I think, you know, sparked by the passion, that's hopefully something that can work. But as I say, I'm hopeful one day I'll find a fourth leg. But I think those three really seem for me quite clear that they're a necessity. Has anybody found a fourth, John? Have you ever thought about adding a
No,
fourth?
it's funny. I've been working on this for 5 or 10 years now. It's even mentioned in the book, and so far nobody seems to have found a fourth leg. I don't know. Maybe they're not looking as actively as you are, not challenging them. I don't know, but I suppose the thing is, if it's a fourth leg, then the stool won't fall over. So maybe it's sort of predetermined, hopefully, as well. But no, I think the point here is it doesn't really matter how many legs the stool has. The point is that it's an analogy, it's a metaphor for making sure you have to have the right components in place to make sure the change happens. And if you don't have the right components in place and you're missing something that's critical, change won't happen. Or even worse, you think that change has happened and it's not really happened.
Well, yeah, and I think that sort of superficial change, it goes back to another point I was thinking of when you referred to those models and the sort of frameworks. I think the ones you mentioned I've found very useful in different ways, but their limitations are that they're just models and they're frameworks, and you can work through them in a very, as you say, sort of surface level tick box type of way. Change isn't really happening. You just sort of assumed to be following steps. So I think that's also quite key. Yes, apply some well thought out, some well selected models, but actually the application of those models is quite key. And I think that's where the three macro activities you've outlined, I think, are really important to reflect on. So we've used this phrase change agent. We've slipped into using that, and it could be all sorts of different things. And we referred earlier to the role of a leader more generally, specifically the role of a manager. So how, if we're thinking about effective change agents, is this sort of term that we're using, how would we summarize that, and what differentiates that then from all of these other terms or the other roles that we see play out?
So yes, Matthew, you make a really good point. Change agent can be a very nebulous term, and it is used a lot at the moment, which is a good thing in one respect. We've touched on the attributes of a change leader also, and what it takes to be effective. However, it does take a superhuman effort to be an effective change leader, as by definition you'll be facing significant cultural headwinds. It does take perseverance. Most cultural change programs, if they're effective, are going to be at least 3 to 5 years in my experience. Some can go faster. It depends on the nature of the work that you're doing. But what sets a good one apart from a mediocre one, as I've said earlier on, is the perseverance. And that takes energy, and it takes the passion, which we've talked about, and also a level of control risk taking, which we've touched on before, i.e. putting your head above the parapet, engagement skills, and also a level of political astuteness, something that we've not really touched on. But I've seen also plenty of good change leaders who've started out with the best of intent, but they haven't been politically aware enough at the start, and they can trip themselves up because you have to be in it to win it. And remember, by definition, at the start of a cultural transformation, the culture may be far from perfect, which actually increases the probability of a change leader being challenged, because they feel that they sit outside. So you've got to be politically astute, because you've got to challenge and support and bring people with you early on, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't hijack or derail people. One of the things that we do in coaching, one of the macro techniques that we use, and it's not rocket science, is challenge, support, challenge, support, challenge, support. If you don't do both in tandem and appropriately, then you're going to fail. So yeah, political astuteness is quite important. So, and I find, I suppose you don't want to talk about politics at length, but to me, political astuteness means how you behave in front of the stakeholders and the senior leadership, how you approach things. And I think in a lot of the conversations that we talk, in a change leadership or in a coaching context, but even just at home in a personal life, it's not necessarily what's said, it's how it's said. So I think that's very important. So really, from my perspective, those are the attributes of a change agent, a change leader. And what I've just sort of more recently discussed is that's what sets apart from a really good one from a mediocre one. And in the same way, we said, don't select coaches or change leaders based on their functioning capability. I think there's another adage that goes there, which I love. I can't even remember who I'm quoting from here, but past performance is not a predictor of future greatness. And I think that's a really powerful term.
It certainly is. Yeah, I think there's something there for people to reflect on. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate you taking the time today to talk this through with me. It's been insightful as always. We've done a few of these now, but thank you for that, and thanks to anybody who's taken the time to listen. We hope the conversation's provoked a bit of further thought about how you go about engaging in change, or particularly how you would effectively lead change. And the sort of topics that John's drawn out there actually relate to a couple of the other podcasts that we produced. What touched on risk towards the end, and we've had a separate conversation about the role of trust and risk, but also the point on passion that John kept coming back to. The energy and focus is another topic of conversation in one of our separate podcasts. So please do have a listen to the other podcasts we've produced and articles and papers that we've written on these subjects. Thank you very much, John. Thank you for those who are listening.
Thank you, Matthew.